What's up, guys, and welcome to the fourth part in the PHP backend with JSON tutorial. And at this point I've created an associative array, which is really a great feature in PHP, really. And I'm calling it output, and I have the index of ID, which I put in the value that I'm iterating in the getAllColors, and then I have the index of color name, and then I put in the value of the color name, and at the end I echo it out as JSON, so I JSON encode it, and then I put in the output, and then I close the connection and so on. So let's have a look at how that looks in the API. So for example, if I choose the getAllColors, now I get it as JSON instead. So you can see the ID of 1 and the color name is brown, and the second object here I get the ID of 2 and the color name red and brown and so on, and that correlates with the database because it's coming from the database, really. So it should be the same values as I got in here, which is great. And also you can see that JSON formats it with the objects as curly braces and arrays as with the brackets. So there is this ending bracket here and a start bracket over here. And so that's really an easy way to get started with the formatting of it. And at this point you should probably wonder and think about how your actual database implementation should look like, because it really depends on what kind of models you're using in your implementation. So for example, I have only one model that is color, and that model only have one attribute, which is a name, really. So you can think in terms of CRUD, which is create, read, update, and delete. And you should think about how these things affect your models. So for example, if you have users in your database, should you be able to create new users? Should you be able to read users? Should you be able to update them? And should you be able to delete them? In most cases, all of them are true, but in some particular cases, just with user, for example, you may not be able to delete the user or update the user, but you should be able to create and read them, for example. But it really depends on your domain. And a lot of the times you should be able to update and delete users, but only if you're authenticated and so on. And but I'm not really going to get in too deep into authentication at this point. So with that being said, we should probably implement basic CRUD functionality for the color model. So for example, we have one endpoint, this is called an endpoint, by the way, that gets all the colors that we use right here. And we also, if you think about the first C in CRUD, it's create color. And we can use that by using another variable called color and checking if that is set. And if it's set, we should insert into color with the column name of color name and the values of the question mark. And we bind the question mark later with the bind param with the s parameter, and then we use the get variable of color. And you should probably validate the get variable. And this is also why I use prepared statements, because of security reasons. For example, if you would have multiple variables here, like I don't know, some variables, and let's have some of them may be integers and some of them may be strings. You're going to define them like this. The first one is a string, the second one is a string, and the third one is a string, and the fourth one is an integer, and the last one is also an integer. So it'll be S for string for the first one, the second one is also a string, which is this one, the third one is also a string, which is this one, and the fourth one is an integer, and then I type I, and then this last one is also I. So that's how you define the variables. But in my case I only have one, so it'll just have one S for string. And I don't need to iterate the result as well, because I'm just inserting. You may want to call the get all colors after this is done, in order to get the user some feedback on what's really happening. And that may be a good way to start, but I'm keeping it really simple here. So let's try this function out. So if I just call all the colors, it look like this, but instead let me try to create a new color. And for example, let's see, one color that I don't got is I don't know, let's call it gravy, because I used that before. It's definitely not a color though. So I'll insert that, and then I'll call the get all colors method again. And as you can see, now I have a color called gravy. So that's the insertion part, that's the create part of it. And you may also want to have some specified filtering, like get color by ID, because you can imagine that there'll be a lot of data in this database in the future. So you may want to implement some kind of filtering, at least by ID. And another thing to think about also is pagination, how you can create different pages with an offset, or maybe like use limit in SQL limit, and then the last index in this selection should be the next variable, so you can continue selecting them and so on. But there is really, the keywords to search for on Google is API and pagination, probably if you have a lot of data. So let's try the get color by ID, and so I use the get color by ID, and the second variable is the get variable like calling ID. So let's try that out, and let's select the first one, and I get an array with one element with the color name brown. If I select number 2, I get red, and so on. And I should probably mention that the ID doesn't necessarily have to do with the order that they come in, because the ID is from the ID column, and it could be the other way around. It doesn't have to. It have to auto increment, but there is nothing saying that, for example, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. It could be 1, 4, 8, 16, 32, or whatever order. So, and as you can see, I do the same thing. I bind my param with I to the get variable, and then I iterate the results as I did before, and I JSON encode it and equates out in the closed connection. So thank you guys for watching, and see you guys later. Bye.